This man has a gorgeous house. He has beautiful babies. He has a beautiful wife. He has an awesome job. Like, why would he want to leave this? And I remember talking to him about it, and that was the first time that I tried to actually say, what do you think about not separating from your wife? Like, what if you really try to work on this? And he had expressed to me that we've tried to work on this, and it's not working, so that is why we're separating.
I remember standing there looking at a picture of his wife and one of his kids, and I stopped, because all I could think was, how do you walk away from something this full? A home most people would give anything for. Before we go any further, let's pause for a moment. 3 innocent lives were taken here, Shanann Watts, Bella, and Celeste. If you believe their lives mattered, type amen in the comments and say a prayer for them, and for every victim whose story was cut short. And while you're here, let me know where you're watching from. This community matters more than people realize. I'm not speaking to you as someone detached from this work. I'm a crime analyst, and I keep digging because I lost 2 of my own children to murder. There are days I want to quit. The travel, the court documents, the FOIA requests, the resistance, the dead ends, it all adds up. But victims were loved too. And once you know that kind of loss, you don't get to look away anymore. I remember talking to Chris Watts early on. I looked at his life, his house, his job, his wife, his babies, and I asked him a question that still echoes in my head. Why not fight for this? Why not try harder instead of tearing it apart? He told me they had tried. He said it was already over. But as we move deeper into 2026, something unsettled has been quietly shifting behind the walls of Dodge Correctional Institution. 4 years, Chris Watts stayed silent, especially when it came to Nichol Kessinger. Almost guarded. That silence didn't last forever. Recently surfaced letters from 2024 and 2025 show a different mindset. In those pages, one word keeps surfacing again and again: manipulated. Chris is no longer presenting himself as the only force behind what happened. Instead, he's pointing back to moments we all remember, but framing them very differently. Take the morning of the murders. Before the world even knew Shanann and the girls were missing, he was urged to delete his Facebook history. At the time, it was brushed off. A cooperating witness being careful. But when you place that moment next to everything we now know, it doesn't look careful. It looks coordinated. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What if the person we were told was helping the investigation was actually shaping it? Everything I'm sharing comes from digging through thousands of pages of discovery, FBI records, and digital forensic reports. So why return to a case most people believe was settled years ago? Because the official ending never sat right with me. Back in 2018, the horror consumed everything. The porch interview. The oil tanks. The shock of a father annihilating his own family. And while the public focused on Chris Watts, the legal process moved fast. Almost too fast, behind the scenes. What stood out immediately was how quickly the focus shifted away from Nichol Kessinger once Chris confessed. One moment, investigators were questioning her movements, her searches, her timeline. Then suddenly, she faded into the background. When I revisited the discovery files years later, the cracks became impossible to ignore. Timestamps that didn't line up. Interview segments that redirected instead of clarified. Questions that stopped being asked once a confession was secured. And that's when I started asking myself, what kind of agreement gets made before all the questions are answered? Her phone pinged in Frederick at 6:16 a.m. on the morning of the murders. That detail matters. And yet, it was never fully explored. When cases close this quickly, truth often gets sacrificed for resolution. It feels less like justice and more like containment. The digital forensic evidence paints a different picture entirely. Deleted messages. Erased call logs. All while law enforcement was still searching for a missing pregnant woman and her children. That's not the behavior of someone on the sidelines. So if we really want to understand what happened inside that house, we have to stop looking only at who was arrested, and start paying attention to what was left unexplored. Why was her father so involved in her interviews? Why did her version of events shift each time new evidence surfaced? That's when something clicked for me. This wasn't just about identifying a killer. It was about understanding who influenced the narrative once the damage was already done. The agreement that was made wasn't just about cooperation. It was about shutting the door before the spotlight spread any further. And by doing that, doubt was left behind. This case isn't haunting people nearly a decade later because of curiosity alone. It's because too many pieces never landed where they should have. And now, with these letters surfacing, that carefully maintained silence is starting to fracture. Not explode but crack. Which means what we were told in 2018 may not have been the full picture. It may have been the simplest one. So instead of rushing past the uncomfortable parts, we're going to slow this down. We're going to revisit what was said, what was ignored, and what was redirected. Because once you start laying the interviews next to the data, a different story begins to form. And that story doesn't stop here. This is the space where those questions live. And we're going to keep pulling on them, piece by piece as the picture gets clearer. And this matters because she didn't just look up Shanann out of casual curiosity. Her searches went further. She was looking up men having affairs. She was searching for how to prepare for a new life. All of this was happening while Chris was still living under the same roof as his pregnant wife. Now let's slow down and look at her behavior once the investigation began, because this is where things stop feeling accidental. Nichol Kessinger didn't simply hand her phone over to police. Before she ever sat down with detectives, she had already wiped it clean. Her entire call history, gone. Every text message between her and Chris Watts, deleted. So you have to ask yourself a basic question. If you have nothing to hide, why spend hours scrubbing your digital footprint? That tells me she knew exactly what was on that phone. And she knew how it would look. Maybe even how it could be interpreted, criminally. There's another detail that's always hit me hard. A real gut punch. During her interviews, NK told detectives she didn't even know Shanann was pregnant until the story broke publicly. That statement didn't age well. Because digital forensic analysts later confirmed she spent more than an hour scrolling through Shanann's Facebook and Instagram. Pages filled with pregnancy announcements. Ultrasound photos. Baby updates. So when she says she didn't know, it doesn't sound like confusion. It sounds like strategy. Ask yourself, can someone spend an hour on a pregnant woman's social media and miss the pregnancy entirely? Drop your thoughts in the comments because for me, this is where the unknowing victim narrative really starts to collapse. And that's when another figure steps into the frame. Her father, Dwayne Kessinger. Because NK didn't walk into those interviews alone. Her father was present, often stepping in, steering the conversation, sometimes answering questions for her when things got uncomfortable. And what stood out wasn't just his presence, it was the influence. It felt less like detectives interviewing a potential accomplice, and more like professionals being careful around someone with leverage. Almost like they were sitting across from a corporate executive, not someone tied to a triple homicide investigation. That tells us something important. There was a protective buffer around her from the very beginning. Then there's her job. Nichol Kessinger worked for a contractor tied to Anadarko Petroleum, the same company Chris worked for. The same company that owned the oil site where Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were found. That detail matters more than people realize. Because her role gave her insight into logistics, site layouts, and remote locations. She knew how isolated those oil tanks were. She knew how inaccessible they could be. So when Chris now claims in his recent letters that she manipulated the plan, her professional background makes that accusation far more unsettling. At times, it feels like investigators were so focused on locking in a conviction against Chris that they let a major player quietly exit through the back door. She was treated like a key witness, even as her story shifted each time new evidence surfaced. And that leaves the public with a lingering, uncomfortable question. What if the person pulling the strings never spent a single night in a jail cell? That's why, moving forward, we can't keep looking at her as just the mistress. We have to consider her as a strategist. Someone who understood how to erase herself from a digital crime scene, possibly before the crime even occurred. Which raises a disturbing possibility. If Chris was the hand that carried out the act, was NK the mind that cleared the path? And that leads to an even bigger issue. If the digital evidence shows she was lying about the small things, what else wasn't true? We've talked about the players. We've talked about motive. Now I want to take you deeper, into the wires, the signals, the data points that were treated like background noise. By 2018, digital forensics were already highly advanced. But the way they were applied in this case feels selective. As I worked through thousands of pages of FBI technical reports, patterns began to emerge, patterns that don't align with the official narrative. Chris Watts was sloppy with his digital trail. Nichol Kessinger was precise. But there was one thing she couldn't fully erase. And this is critical. The cell tower ping at 6:16 a.m. on the morning of the murders. That single data point made me question the physics of her alibi. And Kay lived in North Glen, roughly a 25-minute drive from the Watts home in Frederick. She told investigators she was at home, waking up, getting ready for work. But her phone didn't ping a tower near her house. It hit a tower in Frederick, just minutes away from where Shanann and the girls were being transported. Phones don't wander on their own. The phone was there, someone was there. So what was she doing in Frederick at that exact moment? Watching the house? Waiting for confirmation? Waiting for a signal? What do you think? Is that just a glitch? Or is a cell tower ping the most honest witness in this entire case? Let me know in the comments, because to me, a phone doesn't lie about where it is at 6:16 in the morning. And almost immediately after that, the digital scrubbing intensified. The urgency is what stands out. Before police even officially declared Shanann missing, Kessinger was already urging Chris to erase his Facebook. Think about that. She was managing digital evidence before there was even a public crime. That doesn't feel like panic. It feels like preparation. She didn't just tell him to delete things, she deleted things herself. Her entire call log disappeared. Every text with Chris was gone. And that raises another question. Why didn't investigators push harder? A cooperating witness doesn't destroy the very data needed to build a timeline, which tells us she was either unbelievably lucky, or she understood exactly how far she could go without consequences. Then there are the Google searches. We already know she was researching Shanann long before the affair was official. But there's one search from 2018 that still sends a chill through me. She searched for, can police recover deleted text messages? How long do phone companies keep records? That's when something clicked. These aren't the searches of someone heartbroken or blindsided. These are the searches of someone thinking about forensic recovery. When you place those searches on a timeline, things get even more troubling. They happened right around the time she claimed she was just realizing Chris had been lying to her. But the data shows she was already worried about what could be retrieved, before she ever went to police. Which means her cooperation may not have been about honesty. It may have been about control. A carefully curated version of the truth, crafted around what she knew she couldn't delete from the servers. And then we come to the coordinates. Nichol Kessinger was an environmental safety officer. She understood GPS data. She knew site coordinates. She knew layouts. And that detail changes how everything else looks moving forward. The FBI later confirmed something that deepens this entire picture. They found that Nichol Kessinger had accessed map data connected to Anadarko's remote oil sites, specifically the very locations where the bodies were eventually discovered. That detail matters, because it tells us she wasn't just familiar with the idea of those fields, she understood them. She knew how remote they were. She knew how to navigate them, even in the dark. So when Chris now writes years later that everything was manipulated, we have to pause and ask, who exactly understood the terrain well enough to shape a plan around it? This is why the digital trail isn't only about what investigators found. It's about what they never filled in. That unspoken agreement, the deal that was made early, allowed entire digital gaps to stay untouched, unchallenged, unexplored. Which means, as we move closer to 2026, the only real path to the truth leads back to the servers, back to the cloud, because technology has changed. What was erased in 2018 may not be invisible anymore. And if that data resurfaces, the question becomes simple and terrifying. Whose story collapses when it does? To understand that, we have to focus on the most critical window in this entire tragedy. The first 48 hours. While the world watched a nervous father on a front porch, something far more calculated was happening behind the scenes. We were told Nichol Kessinger was a victim of deception. A woman who came forward because it was the right thing to do. But when you study her actions during those first 2 days, a very different pattern appears. That's when I started asking myself whether we were witnessing a witness, or a lesson in forensic evasion. Before she ever walked into a police station, Nichol Kessinger was busy. Not panicked. Not frozen. Precise. She spent hours erasing every trace of her communication with Chris Watts. Call logs disappeared. Text messages vanished. Even her search history was wiped clean. If you're truly innocent, if you've just realized the man you're seeing may be connected to something horrific, your instinct is to preserve evidence, not destroy it. What stood out to me was how controlled the entire process was. She navigated the investigation in a way that ensured police only saw what she allowed them to see. And when you place that behavior next to the letters Chris wrote in 2024 and 2025, the meaning shifts dramatically. Because Chris claims the digital cleanup wasn't spontaneous. He says it wasn't even his idea. In those letters, he describes Nichol as the one giving instructions, telling him what to delete, which apps to remove, what needed to be gone before law enforcement touched his phone. That changes everything. The image of the unaware mistress disappears, and in its place is someone who clearly understood the weight of a digital footprint. From there, we have to examine how she handled investigators themselves. Because she didn't just answer questions, she redirected the narrative. She framed the story around her own heartbreak. A woman betrayed by lies about a divorce. Yet her own phone data showed she had been searching for Shanann for over a year. So what she really did was give police just enough information to keep their focus elsewhere. She cooperated, but selectively. Which means she wasn't simply helping the investigation. She was steering it away from herself. Let me ask you something, and really think about it. If you were the investigator sitting across from her, would this look like panic? Or would it look like someone cleaning a digital crime scene in real time? Drop your thoughts in the comments because the line between victim and accomplice often comes down to one thing: what evidence gets destroyed. And here's why this matters so much. Law enforcement allowed her to set the terms of her cooperation. They never pressed her on why she deleted her SIM card so quickly. They didn't challenge why she was Googling, "Can police see deleted texts?" before ever contacting them. That tells us something crucial. She was measuring the perimeter of the law before stepping inside it. While Chris was unraveling, failing a polygraph, contradicting himself, Nichol was composed, managing exposure, controlling damage. Which tells us the power dynamic in this relationship was never what it appeared to be. And if Chris is telling the truth in his latest letters, then Nichol wasn't a bystander at all. She was the one holding the manual. She understood that in 2018, if you erased data fast enough, it might stay gone forever. What she didn't anticipate was the FBI's ability to recover the ghosts of deleted files. At this point, it feels less like coincidence and more like calculated manipulation. Someone who knew exactly how to play the victim role, perfectly. She gave investigators a monster they could convict quickly. And in return, she walked away with her future intact. Which means those first 48 hours weren't about finding the truth. They were about burying it. And the most effective manipulation didn't happen behind closed doors at home. It happened inside interview rooms. So keep this image in your mind as we move forward. A woman erasing her digital history, while volunteers are out searching for two little girls. Because as we go deeper into this investigation, we have to confront a hard question. Who was really controlling the script? The hand that deletes evidence can be just as powerful as the hand that commits the act. And when we talk about a tragedy of this scale, we expect shock, grief, collapse. But when you examine Nichol Kessinger's digital behavior in the days after the murders, you don't see shock. You see strategy. And that's when I started questioning not just the case, but the soul of the investigation itself. Why did the district attorney move so fast to shield her? Especially when her digital trail was practically begging for deeper examination? That question is the one I couldn't shake. Because while the world was still reeling from the discovery of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, Nichol Kessinger wasn't searching for ways to cope with trauma. She wasn't looking up justice for the victims. On August 19, 2018, her searches were about something else entirely: her own future. Discovery records show that while investigators were still working the scene, Kessinger was Googling things like how much money did Amber Fry make in Amber Fry book deal. Let that sink in. How does someone who has just learned her boyfriend annihilated his family immediately start calculating the earnings of a famous mistress? And it didn't stop there. She also searched whether the public liked Amber Fry, and explored the idea of brand ambassador opportunities. At that point, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. She was thinking about optics, about positioning, about profit. What struck me most was the absence of empathy required to study the Amber Fry blueprint while the bodies of two little girls had barely been recovered. And here's where the role of the district attorney becomes impossible to overlook. The DA's office had access to these same search records before finalizing the agreement that protected her. So the question becomes, why was she given immunity so quickly? It suggests the system valued a clean, fast plea deal over a full accounting of everyone involved. They wanted a star witness, and they were willing to look past troubling behavior to secure one. That's why this deal feels like a betrayal of the victims. Ask yourself this: does someone researching book contracts and branding opportunities in the immediate aftermath of a massacre deserve the full protection of the state? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because to me, this detail shatters the idea that she was merely a victim. It suggests she was already envisioning her own notoriety. In other words, she was preparing for media attention while investigators were still identifying bodies. That realization forced me to wonder whether the DA's office ever truly considered her a suspect at all. Because the moment she handed over a carefully selected version of events, she was treated like a hero. They fell for the same innocent mistress narrative she had been crafting since she first began tracking the Watts family online in 2017. And here's the part that really matters. That immunity deal didn't just keep her out of jail, it spared her from explaining those searches in front of a jury. If this case had gone to trial, those Amber Fry searches would have been devastating character evidence. They would have dominated the courtroom. Instead, the rush to close the case became a shield. Efficiency replaced accountability. The system chose speed over truth. And in doing so, it allowed someone who appeared to be calculating her potential payday to quietly disappear, protected by a new identity and a sealed agreement. That's when the true weight of the secret deal becomes clear. It wasn't just about justice for Shanann. It was about how much the state was willing to overlook to secure a confession. And if we accept that version of events, we're also accepting something dangerous. That destroying evidence and planning personal gain is forgivable as long as you help close the case. So yes, the file may be closed on paper. But for anyone who believes in real justice, it remains wide open. Which brings us to the next phase of this story. We've examined the digital gaps. We've seen the silence from the legal system. Now we have to step into the most unsettling territory of all. The mind of Chris Watts in 2026. Time changes a man. Especially one confined to a maximum security cell in Wisconsin, surrounded by nothing but concrete and memory. In the early years, Chris stayed quiet, almost protective of Nichol Kessinger. That has changed. As the distance from 2018 grows, the man who once absorbed all the blame has started to speak. And what he's saying is beginning to fracture the original narrative. Chris Watts in 2026 sounds like someone with nothing left to lose. No family. No freedom. And no illusion that the woman he once saw as his escape is coming back. That's when I began questioning the meaning of these new revelations. Chris now describes a darker dynamic, claiming Nichol didn't just love him, she conditioned him. He says she exploited his emotional weaknesses, constantly painting a future where his responsibilities simply vanished. According to him, the promises came with conditions. A life together, if he fixed the situation with Shanann. And this part is critical. He describes the manipulation as gradual. A slow drip. Isolation from his parents. Reframing his daughters as burdens instead of blessings. The word he uses over and over is control. He claims she coached him on how to act during the investigation, assuring him that if they stayed silent and played their roles, they'd eventually reunite. Now we have to stop and ask the hardest question of all. Is this the confession of a man finally facing his conscience? Or the calculated bitterness of someone who realized he'd been abandoned? That's what makes this psychology so dangerous and so difficult to untangle. This is where tonight's chapter ends, not with answers but with unease. Because prison walls don't seal the truth. They just muffle it. A case can be stamped closed. A sentence can be handed down. But questions don't disappear just because the system says move on. Somewhere between official records and whispered doubts, the truth still lingers, waiting, watching, unresolved. And as long as there are cracks in the story, as long as timelines don't align, as long as someone benefits from silence, we will keep asking. This is Cellblock Shades, where shadows remain, stories aren't finished, and justice is never assumed. In this case, it may be filed away, but it is far from over.